Each year since 1976, the National Urban League has released its highly anticipated report on the state of Black America. The report has become the national touchstone for the social and economic status of African American and Latino communities. This year's 40th anniversary report, Locked Out: Education, Jobs, and Justice, addresses the social and economic crisis facing communities of color through the lens of the past 4 decades. Each year, we not only ask the question, what is the state of Black America, but offer innovative and comprehensive solutions. The 2016 State of Black America is presented as a message to our next president, a president who takes office amid a climate of unprecedented pressure to reform our broken criminal justice system. Joining me now to discuss unlocking criminal justice reform are Monalisa Johnson, founder and CEO of Parents with Incarcerated Children; Kenneth J. Montgomery, attorney and professor at Fordham Law School; and George Curry, editor-in-chief of Emerge News Online. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And I think you are all going to be able to speak to this personally and professionally today, so we have a lot to get into. But I think, you know, just as a scene setter, I'm going to tell you some numbers that you already know. We need to look at how sentencing disparities, racial profiling, mandatory minimums all contribute to mass incarceration, and how this kind of also trickles into our general economic inequality. So some of the numbers are still quite startling. People of color are still significantly overrepresented in the U.S. prison population, making up more than 60% of the people behind bars. And despite being only 13% of the overall U.S. population, 40% of those who are incarcerated are Black. So I think just a broad question before we get to personal stories. I want to start with you, Kenneth. What accounts for the massive racial disparity in arrests, in sentencing, and incarceration in the United States?
I think it's symptomatic of institutional and systematic racism and policies that have existed years ago, from the beginning that this country was formed. And I think we're actually watching the symptoms, but it's institutional and it's systemic. When you have a group of people who are set upon and are alienated politically, socially, and economically, and then you add on that the mass incarceration system has to do with dollars and economics, then it makes sense that we're where we're at. And then you talk about the history of our education here. So it's to me, it's a no-brainer, to be quite honest.
I mean, and George, you've been covering criminal justice for a number of years, our elder statesman with this institutional knowledge yourself. You know, why are we seeing this disparity from your research and your reporting?
Well, I think you look at all the indicators. We look at poverty, when you look at unemployment, just opportunities, that's one aspect. The other aspect is that the deeper you get in the criminal justice system, the greater disparity. The disparity in terms of whether you get arrested, whether you're sentenced, how long you're sentenced for. That is, as Kenneth said, is systematic. And so you got those two coming from you at 2 different angles, and so it's not a surprise at all.
Right. Monalisa, I'd love for you to speak personally about this issue. You know, what accounts for this disparity, and why is this an issue that is personal to you?
Well, it's personal to me because my daughter is incarcerated, and she is facing a mandatory, well, she's serving a mandatory minimum sentence, a 10-year sentence. And I personally think that we've created a carceral state, if you will. I think human rights are being violated on a consistent basis by the criminal justice officials. And I believe that without a shadow of a doubt that there's a lack of accountability there. And because of that, it's created a distrust in our community. It's created disrespect towards law enforcement as a whole. And I think that as they continue to make bad judgments, as they continue to create sentences that are just absolutely not equal across the board, it's going to continue to create mass incarceration until we get a hold of the officials.
Right.
And someone really starts to watch them and police them.
Right.
I think we're going to continuously have this problem.
Yeah, I mean, can we talk about, Kenneth, maybe the layers of where does this problem even start? You know, are we talking about police officers? Are we talking about judges? Are we talking about a system that's very just intertwined?
Absolutely. I think it's a cultural thing. You know, when you talk about police officers, you know, it was a big case in New York concerning stop and frisk over the last couple of years. You can't legislate what's in the heart. And unfortunately, the fiber of many of the attitudes in this country are of a racist nature. So now you have police officers who are asked to make arrests. When you want apples, you go to apple orchards. When you want arrests, you go to Black and Hispanic communities. You have these quotas. You have a paramilitary stance that law enforcement takes in Black communities. And that's because politically we've been disenfranchised. You can't take a paramilitary stance in Park Slope or Upper East Side or Upper West Side, because if you do, there's going to be some backlash politically. But for some reason, our communities have always been misled or underrepresented. So then you have that. And then you have a lack of diversity on the judiciary, and I'm talking state and federal. You have the same group of people who go to the same Ivy League schools, who have the same experiences, same societal experiences, and they are now judging. So what you really have is, from a majority standpoint, you have the sons and daughters of privilege who are in a position to judge the people who the privilege didn't work out for. And you're seeing that in the sentences, you're seeing that on a state and federal level. So it's a symbiotic relationship where it all works together, and unfortunately, many of us, young Black men and women, street and prison culture has been commodified. So now when it's been commodified and it's sold through music, through entertainment, it creates a horrible scenario. And I think that's what we're dealing with. And for that to change, it has to be a reawakening in ideology and a lot of other things that has to take place.
And I also think it's a matter of perception. You can't separate police officers and judges from whites in general, the racism in this country that we've experienced the whole while we've been here.
Absolutely.
So therefore, it's how you perceive a kid who's in a park with a toy gun. Immediately you see, hey, this is a criminal. And I got to kill this person. I got to shoot him in the back. Because you have a certain perception of them that's already tainted, and therefore your actions are going to be controlled by that.
And now economics is involved. When you look at the privatization of the mass incarceration system, when you look down that list, it's the
prison industrial complex.
So it's this thing where
prisons keep counties running.
You have citizens upstate in New York who will vote that politician out if these prisons get shut down.
Right. So,
you know, this is what we're dealing with. Now there's an incentive beyond the cultural, racist, historical incentive. Now there's a financial incentive.
Absolutely.
Right. Monalisa, you know, what kind of reform is even possible in this sort of environment? I mean, we're not going to be maybe we're not closing these prisons, but what kind of reform are you and your organization kind of pushing for and looking at to help, you know, young people who are incarcerated?
Well, you know, I'm glad that you asked me that, because reform is possible, in my opinion, even in this political environment that we have, mainly because when you start to think about why reform is even being talked about in today's times, and you really look at where it came from and where it started from, it could be because Bobby and Susie now is going to prison. It could be because Billy and Susan, you know, or whoever, they're going. And now that the Caucasian community is being affected greatly, it's becoming now an issue. And so with that becoming an issue, there is a great deal of attention being given. And thank God it is, because now the doors are open. And as far as what our organization is doing, we're focusing in on the formation and implementation of independently empowering citizens and communities to become watch people, to become police, if you will, over the court systems, over the probation systems, the parole systems, and over the mandatory minimums and mass incarceration as a whole. It's a holistic approach, the way we see it. And we really want to focus in on assuring that in reform that you think about the families The families are the biggest part of ensuring that there is no recidivism. If the families are left out of this equation, and if we as parents, in particularly with incarcerated children, are left out of the equation, looking at our emotional fortitude, looking at our financial backing and understanding, because it costs money to keep a kid in prison. It costs me more money to keep my daughter in the prison system than it did to keep her in college. So our organization is looking at it from a holistic perspective. It has a lot that we're looking at. It's overwhelming, actually.
The ultimate reform is not to get into the system, because this system is well prepared to chew young black men and women and Hispanic men and women up. I think Monalisa is correct. Even in New York, there's a it's an opiate epidemic where you have a lot of huge swaths of the white community kids who are now getting addicted or perhaps overdosing, and the system now is saying, wait a minute.
The attention is there, and the resources are flowing in.
But however, years ago when, the crack epidemic and the heroin epidemic hit in the 60s and the 70s, there was no empathy or compassion. But I think ultimately what needs to happen is the people who are on the ground, the teachers, the lawyers, the journalists who know what the problems are, they need to get together, and we have to have a reflection process, and then we have to come up with some viable solutions. And I think those solutions start with education and creating critical thinkers and problem solvers, and it ends with some form of economic. Because I think poverty is a large, I think George had hit on it, that's a large part of the problem as well. And I think the resources have to be put in the right place to really pull back a group of people who have been alienated, and alienated so much that they now are just assumed to be willing participants in this system. And I think the ultimate reform has to not even get into this system.
Right. George, how do you attack this?
Well, Kenneth, right, you got to get them before it starts. You think about it, we're 5% of the world population, but we incarcerate 25% of the world's prisoners. That's unconscionable. But I do see some hope in the sense that you even have Democrats and Republicans, conservative and liberals now talking about this issue for different reasons, of course.
It starts with a conversation.
But for different reasons. Because, first of all, they can't afford it anymore. Can't afford to keep people locked up. And they're saying, look, for no other reason than that, we need to have a different discussion. You're talking about mandatory sentencing, what your daughter got hooked up into, because you're taking the power away from judges. Why give them the ropes if they can't decide? You're saying, hey, you're going to serve this amount of time. I don't care what the circumstances are. And so you're taking a second look at these kinds of things, and so it has to be some basic reform there.
And even federal, I do a lot of federal work as well as capital punishment on the federal level. When you look at who are sitting in Washington on the sentencing commissions that make up the culture of law enforcement, it's not the people who are on the other end of it. So I think, when we're saying reform, I think people have to empower themselves, and the communities have to empower themselves to prevent these young people from even getting in it. Because once they get in it, there's a stigma that's attached where it affects your education, it affects your ability to have other options and choices.
Yeah, but has prosecution become about locking people up?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a former prosecutor. It absolutely is. It's about, you get these initiatives. So to give you an example, you get a federal grant from Washington, the police department gets. And to get that grant, they have to justify. So now, New York City, One Police Plaza, they have these things called SATCOM, where it's all about statistics. They've literally honed in on the community, and they can tell how many gun arrests, rape arrests, burglaries, drugs, narcotics, and it becomes a system that has to feed. And unfortunately, when you have these communities that have no leadership, and the men have been removed from the majority of these black urban areas, then that is where you go to find these arrests. And prosecution is all about that. And they may say otherwise, but if you sit a prosecutor, what I call a lifer down, and you ask him or her, as they pick in a jury, ask them in jury selection how many people of color that they willingly put on the jury.
I also think it's about how we look at crime and how we deal with it. You talk about all this crazy stuff you hear Republicans saying, false tweets with Trump saying how many crimes that blacks commit against whites. It's so outrageous when most crime It's intraracial. It's not
Yeah.
interracial.
Yeah.
90% of blacks are killed by other blacks. 82% to 84% of whites are killed by other whites. And so we know that about homicide. We also know that 72% of homicide, the victim and the assailant know each other. 72%.
Wow.
So we know that, and we know that 51% of them start because of an argument. We got to talk about anger management. We got to talk about how do we resolve conflict different ways, and we got to deal with gun reform.
Yeah. What are the other ideas for innovation with regard to reform and also in communities?
I think education, to me, I try a lot of cases, and I'm in federal and state court a lot. I think education, creating our own schools and curriculums is absolutely necessary and key. I think having more teachers of color is absolutely necessary and key. I think having mentoring and apprenticeship programs at an early age so that young people can have a concept of doing something other than entertaining or athleticism is very important and key. But if you don't have a mentoring process where the kids understand that, hey, I can write code, I didn't know it was that easy, and I can get in it that young, then they're not going to make that choice. People, unfortunately, are rigged to do what they can see.
Right.
And I think the imagery and the things that these young people are seeing is just wrong. Right. And I think education is the absolute key. We need more teachers from our neighborhoods and our communities to start schools. We need more of them to teach. We need more extracurricular mentoring and tutoring apprenticeship programs for it to offset the distractions that are plenty out there.
Yeah.
Right.
Monalisa, why are women so often left out of this conversation?
That's interesting.
That's changing too.
Is it changing? Yeah.
I don't think that it is changing.
Well, I think more women are being put into this system as defendants.
It's a fast
absolutely,
It's a
yes.
fast segment.
Yeah.
I
We
agree
always
with it.
talk about young boys and boys in prison, and I think we are hearing more reports about women in the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, but please, diagnose this.
So I think that, women are left out of the conversation to a certain degree, and when I say that, I'm saying that we're not looking at the overall rights that the women have. If you look at men in prison and women in prison, they have completely different sets of rules. For the men, the men can have TVs, they can have cats and dogs, they can have gyms, they can have all kinds of different visitation opportunities where they don't have to have lists. Women they're only allowed to have 6 people on their list during the year. There are no gyms, no fitness opportunities. They can't have any televisions. They don't have pets. They don't have dogs. They don't have horse programs. They don't have any of the things that the men are having. And at the same time, they're being sexually assaulted while they're in prison, getting pregnant while they're in prison. How is that so? Yeah. They are being left out of the conversation because what's happening is we're just looking at overall, just the black male.
Right.
But we're not looking at overall the female. The female too is having issues. They are having issues from their family that are starting to stem into outward actions that eventually land them into incarceration. Like, for example, my daughter. I mean, here's a perfect example. She was in college. She was doing extremely well in college, but yet she gets yoked up in what they call the party atmosphere, and then the next thing you know, she's doing a drug called Molly, and then before you know it, that drug has gotten her involved into some things that, she would not normally do because she's out of character. Right. But when she gets to this point of now being charged, and by the way, she was guilty and did agree and admit to her guilt. So I'm not painting the picture that my daughter, is an innocent flower. I am saying that when she got into this position, when she got to the doorsteps of being judged, she was never asked, are you a drug addict? Can we do any type of transitional sentencing? Can we consider putting you into a mandatory drug rehab and then bringing you out to a prison and then bringing you out to home, what is it called? Home
detention.
Home detention.
Yeah.
Home detention. None of these things are being considered for females or males, and just in general, to me, I think they're being left out of the conversation.
Yeah. George, is there also a pipeline problem when it comes to just our criminal justice system, as far as young black people growing up and saying, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a judge, or I'm going to sit on that jury? Can you speak to any of that side of the conversation?
Ken mentioned earlier mentoring. And to me, I think that's the key. I've been mentoring. I started a journalism workshop 40 years ago. You call me the elder statesman, so I confess. So I started one in St. Louis with the local NABJ Black Journalists chapter. Started one in D.C. Started one in New York. A lot of those are my journalism baby kids. They're out here in the field now. If every profession did that, before college, long before college, to show them alternatives, I think it will make a great difference in our communities. And that's something we can do instead of saying, oh, the system is rotten. It is rotten.
Outreach.
But there's some things we can do too.
But and that starts with us. Our problem culturally is that, we don't have a working ideology. The ideology that most black people are taught in their community is to get out and don't look back.
Right.
And everyone leaves. And when everyone leaves,
They don't reach back.
they don't reach back, and the community is set upon. And it's a lot of it can be talked about in Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth. It's just set upon and it falls apart. And at some point, if we want our communities to vibrate and pulsate, people are going to have to come back, like myself, like Monalisa, like George, like you, like whoever, and be a part of that process. Because unfortunately, the distractions in which these kids that I represent, it would amaze people, some of these stories that are happening. And when you listen to the music, and I grew up on the music as well, just like anyone else, but when you listen to it and you see the millions of dollars that are spent to sell it, a certain culture, and then you see what's happening in the schools, and then there's statistics and data that they are looking at, these guys who are investing in these prisons, that they can tell if the kid is not gonna make it out of 3rd or 4th grade or a certain markers, they're already planning for the prison side of things.
Absolutely.
And that comes from a de-evaluation of our lives, of our lives. And so until we have a reflection process, I don't think the answer can come from a president. I don't think the answer can come from a corporation. I think the answer has to come from within the community.
Well, and then let's talk, let's push this forward to this election year. My last question, I'm going to start with George here. Just what should be our message to the next president with regard to criminal justice reform?
One is you don't go in, as some of the candidates have done on both sides, stereotyping who we are. You mentioned black to Bernie Sanders, and he's talking about the ghetto. We're not all living in the ghetto. And so I think one is they have some kind of real relationship with us and understand that it's not just you get beyond their own stereotypes. And they have to commit to us saying, look, we got to do something about these police killings. We got to do something that said justice means justice in terms of criminal justice system. And we got to make some basic reforms that some will be unpopular. Yeah. But you got to do that if you're serious about it, because people won't have confidence in it and the system won't work.
Right. Monalisa, what is your message to the next president?
My message to the next president is to focus in on the humanities issue of the 21st century. This is not just about incarceration. This is a human rights issue. This is a civil rights issue that's continuing and has not stopped. Focus on human rights, because just because someone is guilty and they are going into prison to serve their sentence, they still have rights. They still are humans, and ultimately they still have to come back to society. That's the part we're forgetting. They come back into society. And when they come back into society, if they're not rehabilitated, because God only knows they're not getting rehabilitated. I don't know what they're getting on the inside, but I can promise you it's not rehabilitation. So focus in on the reentry side, focus in on the human rights side, and focus in on our officials, the criminal justice system officials. Put some accountability behind that. Right. You know, put some things in place for the court system, for the parole system, for the probation system, for all of the systems that call themselves law enforcement.
Right. Kenneth, closing note.
I hate to be the cynic. I would tell the next president that I understand the symbolic challenges that they have in dealing with our communities, and I also understand that incarcerating and prosecuting Black and Hispanic people is the best way to get elected if you're a politician. And if you even appear to be sympathetic to the historical issues that have created this prison population, or I think is about somewhere around 2.4 million people incarcerated, then I think you're being dishonest. But if you're going to be honest about it, then I think you have to look at what is the correlative and causal effects. And when you look at the correlative and causal effects, then you will have real economic programs that generate or sustain viable communities. Then you will really not just this fad of charter schools, but you will go into these communities and start bringing the right teachers and have a real renaissance in education.
Right.
If you're sincere about it. I'm not going to wait for that.
Yeah. Well, sobering note, but it's all connected. We're all hopeful here at this table, I know.
We're very hopeful.
So thank you so much, Kenneth,
for having me.
Monalisa, George. This was a great discussion. Share this web series with your social media friends and followers, and let's continue this discussion online. The State of Black America web series has been presented by AT&T. Thank you, AT&T, for your invaluable support of the National Urban League. We also thank Comcast, NBC Universal for their production support of the State of Black America web series. Together, we are empowering communities and changing lives. For more information on the State of Black America, visit the National Urban League at www.stateofblackamerica.org.